If you've never had the HOA call the cops on you for moving boxes, trust me, you're not missing out. It was the first Saturday of April, crisp air off the lake, and I was finally doing something that made me feel useful again. My daughter, Fiona, had been deployed overseas with the Air Force for 8 months now, and her lease back home was ending. So I decided to move her stuff into our family's lake cabin until she got back. Simple. No drama, or at least that's what I thought. I'd barely unloaded the second box from my truck when I heard the screech of brakes. A white golf cart jerked to a stop on the gravel behind me, and there she was, Jolene Lancaster, HOA president, clipboard in hand like it was a badge of honor. "What do you think you're doing, Gregory?" she asked, arms crossed so tight I thought she might snap in half. I shut the tailgate. "Moving my daughter's things in, she's deployed." "Cabin's ours." "You didn't submit a moving notice," she said, tapping her pen against the clipboard like a metronome of judgment, "and trailers aren't allowed on weekends without prior written approval." "It's not a trailer, it's a truck," I said, "and it's Saturday morning, Jolene. There's nobody here but loons and squirrels." She whipped out her phone like she was pulling a revolver. "I'm calling the authorities. That's unauthorized property activity and possible squatting." I laughed. "Squatting? I've owned this cabin for 23 years. She narrowed her eyes like I'd just insulted her poodle. "We'll see what the sheriff says." Sure enough, 20 minutes later, a county cruiser rolled up while I was halfway through carrying Fiona's duffel bags inside. Deputy Monroe stepped out, sunglasses on, already looking tired. "Greg," he said, "Jolene here says you're trespassing." I looked at him, then at Jolene, then back at him. "You've been to our 4th of July fish fry. You know this is mine." He rubbed his temples. "Do you have proof of ownership?" "Inside the cabin, with the rest of the paperwork." "And the deeds on file at the clerk's office." While I went to grab the docs, Jolene started talking the deputy's ear off about how the HOA had passed a new motion last month requiring all property usage changes to be reviewed by the board. Monroe looked like he was mentally checking out. I handed him the deed. "Here, signed, witnessed, and notarized. Jolene's full of it." He scanned the paper, nodded, and turned to Jolene. "He's good, he's on his own property." "But the boxes," she insisted. "There could be weapons, contraband." "You never know with military types." Monroe raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting his daughter brought home contraband from an Air Force base?" "She could have." He looked at me, then back at her. "Ma'am, you need to stop wasting county resources." Jolene huffed, muttered something about standards, and stalked off toward her golf cart. I thought that was the end of it. But that night I found a violation notice duct taped to my front door, bold red letters, "Unauthorized usage." "Fine, $500, hearing to follow." That was the moment I stopped being patient. You don't go after my kid while she's overseas, and you sure as hell don't fine me for using my own home. I wasn't just going to fight the HOA, I was going to end it. By Monday morning, I had already decided I wasn't going to play defense anymore. I took the violation notice off the cabin door, slid it into a plastic sleeve, and drove straight to the county records office. That cabin was more than just a structure with wood siding and a dock out back. It was the only place that still smelled like my late wife's lavender candles and old cedar. Fiona used to catch frogs in the shallows there. The idea that someone like Jolene could try to fine me for using it hit me like a slap. But I wasn't just going to slap back. I was going to tear down the whole rotten system. At the clerk's desk, I asked for every public record tied to the Cedar Ridge Lakefront Association, going back the last 10 years. The woman behind the counter raised an eyebrow but fetched the files anyway. I spent the next 4 hours flipping through contracts, scanned meeting minutes and budget reports. That's when I found the first crack. The HOA's charter had been amended 2 years earlier, supposedly to increase reserve funds for shoreline maintenance. But there was no corresponding invoice activity in the ledger. In fact, the only expense during that period was a $12,000 consulting fee. paid to something called Ridgewater Management Solutions, an entity registered to a P.O. box in a neighboring county. A little research showed that Ridgewater's listed manager was none other than surprised Jolene Lancaster's nephew. I copied everything, including the original charter that predated the amendment. The original required a 2/3 vote of all property owners for any changes to the association's bylaws. But the meeting minutes for the amendment showed only 4 board members present, and no general vote ever took place. That meant the amendment and any rule passed under it was legally invalid. I needed more than paper, though. I needed people. So that evening, I drove around to a few longtime residents I knew, folks who'd been quiet for years because they didn't want trouble. First up was Carl Hammond, a retired machinist who lived 2 doors down from my cabin. He answered the door with a wrench in one hand and grease on his elbows. "Greg, thought you were up there just for the weekend." "Looks like I'm staying longer," I said. "You ever vote on that shoreline amendment a couple years back?" He scratched his chin. "Nope. They said it was just board business. Never saw a ballot." That was the 3rd person who confirmed it. I had my pattern. By Thursday, I had 11 written statements from property owners, each one confirming they'd never been given a vote on the bylaw changes. I scanned everything and compiled it into a file for the county compliance office. But I wasn't done. I called in a favor from an old Army buddy, now a real estate attorney in Madison. He owed me for helping him out of a jam back in '03, and he was more than happy to help me draft a formal petition to dissolve the HOA. Legally, it only took a 60% majority of residents to disband the association, something Jolene and her cronies probably assumed would never happen. The trick was getting the votes quietly. If Jolene caught wind of it, she'd launch a smear campaign faster than you could say nepotism. So I printed the petition under a generic name, Cedar Ridge Property Rights Initiative, and started knocking on doors. Most folks were more than willing to sign once I showed them the financial records and the bylaw violations. Turns out, Jolene had been issuing parking fines that went straight to a personal PayPal account, and there were no receipts for any of the contractor payments she'd claimed were for landscaping. She had been running the HOA like a piggy bank with no lid. One guy, a quiet postal worker named Trent who lived at the edge of the development, told me he'd been fined 4 times for having a garden hose coiled improperly on his fence. He'd paid them just to avoid the hassle. His face went red when I showed him where the money was really going. By the following Tuesday, I had 73% of the community's signatures, more than enough. That's when I filed the petition with the county registrar and requested a formal vote under Wisconsin Statute 703.27. Once the vote was verified, the HOA would legally cease to exist. But Jolene wasn't going to go quietly. That Friday, while I was loading the last of Fiona's boxes into the cabin's storage room, a black SUV pulled up with 2 uniformed men from the county sheriff's office. One of them, a man named Officer Langley, approached with a clipboard. "Mr. Dalton, we have a warrant to inspect the property for illegal subletting." I blinked. "Subletting? That's absurd. This is my daughter's stuff. She's stationed in Qatar." Langley looked uncomfortable. "We received a complaint suggesting the property was being used as an unlicensed vacation rental. Multiple guests, cash payments, that sort of thing." I stepped aside and motioned toward the open storage bins. "You're welcome to look, but this is a setup. Jolene's trying to throw whatever she can to stop what's coming." Langley did a quick walkthrough, found nothing, and apologized. I handed him a copy of the petition and pointed out the fraudulent amendments. She knew she couldn't stop the vote, so she tried to make me look like a criminal. "I want that documented." He nodded slowly. "You should talk to Detective Carr at the Financial Crimes Unit. This might be bigger than a zoning issue." By Monday, Carr had opened a preliminary investigation into the HOA's finances. I handed over everything, every invoice, every signature, every page of the ledger. The detective barely concealed his disbelief when he saw how much money had moved through Ridgewater Management Solutions. "This isn't just mismanagement," he muttered. "This is wire fraud." News spread like wildfire. By the time the formal vote was certified and the HOA was officially dissolved, Jolene had already lawyered up. County investigators froze all Ridgewater assets, and subpoenas went out to every board member who'd signed off on those fake amendments. The best part: the county held a public meeting 2 weeks later to announce the findings. Over 60 residents showed up. Detective Carr read off a list of violations, from tax evasion to falsified financial statements. When he got to the part about Jolene's nephew funneling HOA dues into his own business accounts, the room erupted in gasps. Jolene sat in the back, stone-faced, not saying a word. When it was over, the county commissioner stood up. "The Cedar Ridge Lakefront Association is hereby dissolved. All remaining funds will be returned proportionally to property owners, and any future governing body must be approved by a public vote with full transparency." No one clapped, no one cheered. They were too stunned. But as we filed out of the community center, neighbors patted me on the back, shook my hand, even offered to help around the cabin if I needed anything while Fiona was gone. I didn't need applause. I just needed it to be over. Jolene was indicted the following month on 3 counts of embezzlement and 1 count of filing fraudulent documents with a government agency. Her nephew vanished from the state. The golf cart, impounded as evidence. The lake was quiet again, just the way it used to be. By early June, the sun had warmed the lake just enough to draw out the paddle boards and fishing rods. It should have been a quiet season of porch coffee and late evening fireflies. Instead, I was fielding calls from the district attorney's office and watching plainclothes investigators photograph Jolene's golf cart from every angle. The audit had turned up more than anyone expected. The financial side was just the beginning. Turns out, the HOA had been pulling strings behind the scenes that stretched far beyond fines and fake amendments. Detective Carr, who'd taken a particular interest in the case, called me one morning while I was sanding down the dock. "She didn't just misappropriate funds," he said, voice steady. "We're looking at possible forgery and evidence tampering." I paused mid-sand. Tampering with what? Property records, lot boundaries. Some of the older residents had extra square footage reassigned without notice. She filed backdated plats claiming the HOA had easements that don't exist. "We've got 3 parcels in dispute, and one of them involves waterfront access." That hit harder than I thought it would. Waterfront access in Cedar Ridge determined property value more than anything, and losing it could gut a home's worth. "Who owns the land in question?" I asked. Carr hesitated. "Technically, you do. But she tried to sign over a portion of your shoreline to the HOA last fall, claimed it was unused common ground. The paperwork was forged." I stared out at the dock, imagining Jolene just casually slicing off a chunk of our cabin's history like she was trimming hedges. Carr continued, "We're pursuing felony fraud, but we need a statement from you confirming you never authorized that easement transfer." "You'll have it today," I said. "But I want to see the original documents." Later that afternoon, I drove into town and met Carr in a small side office at the sheriff's annex. He laid out photocopies of the fraudulent plat changes. Sure enough, my signature had been pasted onto a transfer form dated 6 months ago when I hadn't even been in the state. It wasn't just sloppy, it was arrogant. "The notary seal doesn't match any registered in the county," Carr said, pointing to the bottom corner. "We traced it to a defunct mobile notary company that shut down 3 years ago. So she used a dead seal and a forged signature to steal part of my shoreline. She did it with at least 2 other properties as well. We're contacting the owners now." I signed my witness statement and left the office with a folder of copies. On the way home, I stopped by Carl Hammond's place. He was working on a busted-out board motor in his driveway, and I handed him the pages. "She tried to take your dock too," I said. He wiped his hands on a rag and squinted at the papers. I'll be damned. That's why the survey flags were there last fall. She told me it was just a drainage check. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of it settling in. Jolene hadn't just abused power, she tried to rewrite the map of the neighborhood. That night, I called a meeting at the community boathouse. No HOA, no board, just neighbors. I brought a thermos of black coffee and a stack of printouts. Nearly 40 people showed up, some standing in the back, others sitting on coolers. Carl opened the floor for me. I started simple. I thought it ended with the fines, then I thought it ended with the fake consulting company. Now it turns out Jolene had her hands on our land deeds. I passed around the documents, letting people see the forged signatures for themselves. Murmurs turned to raised voices. Someone in the back, Mrs. Reinhardt, I think asked what would happen to the properties affected. "We've got the DA and the county assessor coordinating now," I said. "They're working to reverse every fraudulent change, but we need to stay organized. Just because the HOA's dead doesn't mean the damage disappeared." That's when Trent, the postal worker, stood up. "My property backs into that drainage path," she marked. "I kept getting notices about maintenance fees, but I never saw any crews. I checked the easement on my deed last week. It's been changed." I nodded. "We're compiling every instance. If you've had your easement altered, your dock line moved, or been charged for services that never happened, we document it. We submit it to the DA's task force." Another voice piped up, Louisa Marks, who ran the tiny antique store on the edge of the development. "She told me last summer I needed to pay a view fee because my second-floor porch overlooked the water. Said it was a new policy. I paid it in cash." That was new. I looked at Carr the next morning and told him about the so-called view fee. He raised an eyebrow. "That's extortion," he said. It turned out Jolene had invented a slew of informal charges, camera installation permits, wildlife hazard surcharges, even a bizarre resonance fee for outdoor speakers. None were documented in any official bylaws. They were just threats delivered with confidence and a clipboard. The DA's office expanded the investigation to include over a dozen residents who'd made payments without receipts. The total theft estimate crossed $80,000. And as the case grew, so did the attention. Local media picked it up. First a short blurb in the county paper, then a TV segment. When the story broke statewide, Jolene's name became synonymous with HOA corruption. Reporters camped outside her house until she finally fled the area, leaving behind a padlocked front door and a "for sale by owner" sign that was later removed by court order. Meanwhile, the residents of Cedar Ridge did something no one expected. They started rebuilding without a formal association. A volunteer committee formed, not to govern, but to coordinate repairs and pool resources for things like road maintenance and dock safety. No fines, no fees, just neighbors helping neighbors. I helped Carl install a new boundary marker on his property, making sure it matched the corrected plat. We used concrete this time, harder to move than a line of stakes. "You ever think she planned to sell that land?" Carl asked, tightening the bolt. "She planned a lot," I said. None of it worked. By late summer, the DA filed formal charges: felony fraud, criminal impersonation, forgery, wire fraud, and unlawful appropriation of property. Her trial was scheduled for the following spring. She had no defenders left in Cedar Ridge. Even her former board members gave sworn statements to save themselves. At the final pre-trial hearing, Carr called me into his office one more time. "We found another document," he said, handing me a folder. "It's a lease agreement for a dock rental company filed under the HOA's name. She was planning to rent out your shoreline to tourists." The audacity of it made me laugh. How far was she going to take this? Carr leaned back. She thought no one would question her. That's how this always starts. Outside the window, a storm was rolling in. Dark clouds over the lake, wind carrying the scent of pine and rain. It felt like something had shifted, not just in the neighborhood, but in the way people talked to each other. There was no more fear, no more silent compliance, just a community wide awake. I left the office and drove back to the cabin. Fiona's things were all in storage now. Her tour would end in a few months, and she'd come home to a place that had finally been put right. I lit the fire pit that night and watched the first drops of rain hiss into the flames. The lake was quiet again. But this time, it was because the lies had been burned away. The morning of the pre-trial hearing, I was already up before the sun, standing on the cabin's back porch with a mug of black coffee and a legal pad full of notes. The lake looked different now, less like a backdrop, more like a line in the sand. The air had that sharp, early autumn bite, and somewhere across the water, a loon let out a long, lonely call. I wasn't expected to testify that day, but Carr had asked me to be present in case the prosecution needed to reference any of the original documents I'd uncovered. So I dressed in my pressed khakis and the only blazer I hadn't used for a funeral, then drove the 40 minutes into town, rehearsing the details in my head. The courthouse was busy. Not swarmed, but busier than usual for a weekday. A few reporters lingered by the steps, one from the state paper, another I didn't recognize. I kept my head down and walked through the security checkpoint, where a deputy gave me a tight nod of recognition. Inside, the waiting area outside Courtroom C was filled with faces I hadn't expected to see. Trent, Louisa, Carl, even Mrs. Reinhardt in her bright floral scarf. None of them had been asked to attend. They came because this time they wanted to witness it. When the bailiff called Jolene's name, she entered flanked by two attorneys. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her posture was rigid, but the usual icy confidence was gone, replaced by something brittle. Her teal blazer hung loose at the shoulders, and her hair, once immaculately curled, drooped slightly, like even gravity had stopped listening to her. As the hearing began, the assistant district attorney laid out the charges: multiple counts of financial fraud, property misrepresentation, unlawful falsification of documents, and criminal impersonation. But the real blow came when the ADA introduced a new piece of evidence. "This," she said, holding up a series of printed emails, "is correspondence between the defendant and a private land developer from out of state. She offered to sell them exclusive access to the community's shoreline in exchange for a personal payout." There was a low gasp from the gallery. I felt Carl shift next to me. Included in the offer, the ADA continued, was a provision for streamlining ownership transitions to make the land appear unencumbered. That included forging easements and filing false surveys. Jolene's attorney objected, but the judge allowed the emails into the record. After reviewing them in silence, he leaned forward and asked, "Were these documents verified?" "They were recovered from the defendant's personal cloud backup," the ADA replied. "Confirmed via IP trace and digital signature." The judge nodded once, then turned to Jolene. "You're facing serious charges, Miss Lancaster. I suggest you consider the weight of the evidence before deciding how to proceed." Her lawyer requested a recess. During the break, Carr met me in the hallway. He didn't bother with small talk. "She was trying to sell the shoreline to a marina startup out of Illinois," he said. "The kind that installs prefab rental slips and turns private lakes into public launch zones. Did they know the land wasn't legally hers? They do now. The company's already pulled out. But if we hadn't found the offer, she might have gone through with it." I stared past him at the buzzing soda machine, thinking of Fiona's fishing rod, still leaned against the cabin's porch rail, and the old canoe that still had my wife's initials etched below the gunwale. "She was going to pave over the whole damn lake," I said. Carr didn't argue. When the hearing resumed, Jolene had changed her tune. Gone was the denial, the outrage, the performative righteousness. Her attorneys requested a plea agreement. In exchange for avoiding trial, she'd accept full responsibility, surrender all assets tied to the fraudulent activities, and provide sworn testimony implicating anyone else involved. The judge accepted the deal on the condition that restitution would be prioritized. Her sentencing hearing was scheduled for 60 days later. Until then, she was placed on house arrest with a GPS monitor and barred from contacting any Cedar Ridge residents. Outside the courthouse, the air felt thinner, lighter. A few residents stood in clusters, talking in low voices. For the first time in a long while, no one was looking over their shoulder. Carl lit a cigarette and eyed the reporters down the block. "She'll never show her face here again," he said. "She won't have a reason to," I replied. Over the next few weeks, something remarkable happened. Without the HOA's interference, the community started rebuilding itself on its own terms. A few residents drafted a shared maintenance agreement purely voluntary, no enforcement, just a way to chip in for things like plowing and potholes. It passed unanimously. Trent volunteered to coordinate the spring cleanup. Louisa donated a bench for the lakeside trail and asked folks to carve their names into it whenever they contributed in some way. I spent a week helping Carl repaint the old boathouse, not because anyone required it, but because it needed doing. It felt good to work with my hands again. It felt better to know no one could stop me. The county assessor's office finished their property review and mailed out corrections. Every fraudulent easement was voided, every dock line restored. Even Fiona's plot, the sliver of shoreline Jolene had tried to lease, was formally confirmed as part of the original deed. When I called Fiona on our weekly video call, I told her everything. She sat in her bunk, grinning with a half-eaten protein bar in hand. "You declared war on an HOA," she said. "And won." "Just held the line," I replied. "Like you taught me." She laughed, then looked off screen as someone called her name. Before she logged off, she said, "Save me a spot on the dock. I'll be home soon." The sentencing hearing came and went with little drama. Jolene received a 5-year suspended sentence, 1 year of monitored probation, and was ordered to pay back over $75,000 in restitution. Any public role in a community organization was permanently barred. She didn't speak in court. Just nodded once and walked out with her head down. No one followed her. That winter, the lake froze over like glass. I shoveled the path from the porch to the dock, mostly out of habit. I left Fiona's fishing rod leaned against the cabin wall, right where she liked it. The community was quiet again, not because people were silenced, but because peace had finally replaced tension. A few days before Christmas, I received a hand-addressed envelope in the mail. Inside was a photo, the new bench by the trail carved with names, Carl's, Louis's, Trent's, mine. Beneath them, someone had etched 2 words, "Still ours." I taped it to the fridge, not for pride, but for reminder. That sometimes doing the right thing doesn't look like a grand gesture. Sometimes it's just moving boxes for your daughter in the cold. Sometimes it's knocking on doors. Sometimes it's refusing to back down when someone, clipboard in hand, tells you to. And sometimes it's enough to just keep the dock clear and the coffee hot. Because when the fight's over and the lake is quiet, all that matters is who's still standing on the porch with you. And that no one, not even an HOA president with forged documents and a golf cart of delusions, can take that away.